Welcome in, Hokies fans, to this edition of the Tech Sideline Podcast. We record on Monday, October 10th, following Virginia Tech's third straight loss, this time at the hand of the Pitt Panthers. We'll look back at what was a step in the right direction offensively, but a couple steps back on the defensive side of the ball, and also our weekly ACC Power Rankings here on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline Podcast, which starts right now. Welcome into episode 262 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. However you are listening, or if you are watching on our YouTube channel, we do ask that if you are, you like, comment, subscribe, and turn notifications on so you know when we go live with the podcast every single week. A reminder that this edition of the Tech Sideline Podcast is sponsored by First Bank and Trust Company. Who you choose to bank with can make all the difference in your overall experience. First Bank and Trust Company is the bank that puts you first. Visit www.firstbank.com to learn more. Love the shorter ad read. I'm going to memorize that. Got to get the Evan Hughes down. Let's introduce everybody on set today. Across the way, David Cunningham, managing editor for Tech Sideline. To my right, Chris Coleman, lead analyst and columnist for Tech Sideline. In the fourth chair, a very happy Katie Adams. Her Ravens won last night. Behind the scenes, Will Stewart, founder and general manager and today's best podcast producer in the land, assisted by Carter Hill, helping out behind the scenes today. And I'm your host, Jake Lyman. Guys, let's jump into it. Obviously, not the results you wanted heading up to Pittsburgh, a 16-point loss, but there were some things that went in the right direction for Virginia Tech. But let's get it out of the way. We got to talk about Israel Abanikanda. 320 yards, 6 touchdowns, breaking Tony Dorsett's single-game record at Pitt, tying Willis McGahee's ACC single-game record with his 6 touchdowns. What is it with these Pitt running backs against Virginia Tech's defense that they just always seem to have career games?
You know, even like 4 years ago when it was Darren Hall and forget the other guy that had those huge, they both had a huge game against Tech. Like neither one of those guys was like an NFL back or something like that, you know, that they just, Tech's defense was just so bad. You know, without going back and watching the entire game, he had finished with 320 yards. I think he probably earned about half of those, and Tech's defense gave him the other half with just bad run fits and things like that. There were some other times where, you know, the Pitt's offensive line just won one-on-one battles and just outmanned the Tech defense. But there was other times where you were like, oh my gosh, it's just, why are you here? You're just in the wrong spot. You got to understand angles and things like that. It's demoralizing when someone sets records against you. I mean, when you set records that were previously held by Tony Dorsett and Willis McGahee, you're in pretty good company. But the big one to me was he's the first college running back since 1998 to go for 300 rushing yards and 6 touchdowns in the same game, and that was Power 5 running back, and that was Ricky Williams, who did it against Rice, right? So I think when you play a football game, when you're mentioned in the same breath as those guys, then you've got a lot to hang your hat on. He's good. He's very good. He had one 100-yard rushing game last year, and of course that was against Virginia Tech. But he's had 4 so far this year with the 300-yarder thrown in for good measure. So, you know, he's a big back without being too big. He's got good speed, and the Hokies helped him out a lot too.
Yeah, I don't think it was any surprise. I think everybody kind of knew what Pitt was going to do. And it was funny because at the beginning of the game, first like 2 drives, the Pitt fans were booing Pat Narduzzi and Pitt.
They booed their offense off the field on the first possession.
Yeah, because
what a strange game.
And because Tech's defense started really well. It was
3 straight tackles for loss.
3 tackles for loss, and Pitt punted from the back of its own end zone. And then the second drive, I believe, was also a 3-and-out. And then the tide started to turn. But the Pitt fans were already getting a little antsy and upset. And then Abanikanda goes off for 320 yards. And it's like, they're not booing now still, obviously.
Yeah, it's it's a weird game when you start off getting booed and then you set a record at the end of the game.
Maybe Pitt fans should, not get that upset that early. Yeah. But I tweeted last night, I replied to one of Will's tweets, and I said he had 5 rushes for 20 or more yards. If you take those 5 rushes away, and the 5 explosive plays he would have had 116 yards on 31 carries, which is about an average of 3.74 yards per rush. Mm-hmm. That's pretty good defensively for Tech. It could be better, yeah. but then he ripped off an 80-yard run on one play, and I mean, just dominant. And Tech players like Josh Fuga, defensive tackle, spoke in the middle of last week and said, we know exactly what Pitt's going to do. Pitt wants to run the ball. It's pretty obvious. And yes, they did not have Taiwan Garbett, who was just held out, kind of a precautionary thing, trying to recover from an injury. They didn't have Dorian Strong, but still, like 320 yards. That is, and it just kept going up and up and up and up and up. I mean, it's the most rushing yards Virginia Tech's ever given up to a single player. It surpassed Giovanni Bernard. So like, just kind of just like, how do you wrap your head around a rushing game like that?
Especially because he was questionable heading into the game. There was the thought that he might not play. He was in a sling.
Arm was in a sling 7 days before the game.
Yeah, and then there were a couple times where like his first or second touchdown, I believe, that was when Tech kind of had him bottled up, and he just squirted out of there and scored. And I think it was not a great tackling performance on a lot of those plays from Virginia Tech.
It wasn't. The big thing, a lot of it was just bad angles.
Yeah.
I don't think they realized how fast he was, maybe, but it was bad angles either way. Like I said, I mean, anytime you go for 300-plus yards, it's partially because you're good, and it's partially because the defense just has some huge breakdowns, which was the case with Virginia Tech. Like I said, I thought probably half the yards were due to him and his offensive line, and about half the yards were due to just critical mistakes by the Virginia Tech defense, which I know probably kept Pry up on Saturday night.
Well, he probably could have had a bigger one too. I think it was Nasir Peoples that made that like shoestring tackle.
Yeah, that's right.
But People doesn't make that tackle, and he's to the house. So, I mean, it probably could have been a lot worse.
And it was mostly edge stuff, like around the defensive end, outside linebackers, safeties. I know his touchdown run that iced the game when Pitt was up 31-29, and then Caleb Smith fumbled, and then they got the touchdown. I believe it was this touchdown, but he breaks it off the left from around the 10-yard line. And Jalen Stroman came down and attacked his blocker head up instead of attacking the blocker's outside shoulder. If he'd attacked the blocker's outside shoulder, then he has to cut back in to a wall of bodies. But instead, he was able to get to the outside. So when you say football is a game of inches, you're not talking about like getting stopped on the goal line by that much. You're talking about that, like literally, if he had just attacked a few inches to the blockers outside, then that one's probably not a touchdown because he's got to cut it back into a wall of bodies. Not to suggest that they wouldn't have scored on the next play, but it's just little things like that. There are a lot of teaching points for the defensive coaches to go back to in this one.
And Abanikanda, he had those 2 touchdowns, like you mentioned, to ice the game. 2 plays after the Caleb Smith fumble, he scored from 10 yards out, and then Hokies miss a field goal, and 1 play later, he's in the end zone again. But we did see some fight from the Hokies for the first time in a couple weeks, which I thought was good. Down 31-16. Maybe in the last 2 weeks, you kind of just say, all right, not our day. But they battled back. Dawan Lofton with a great touchdown that got the Hokies back in the game. And then some Beamer ball, too, made it at 31-29 and had a chance to tie it with a 2-point conversion. At least like to see the resilience from the team on Saturday.
No doubt, because, Tech had the lead, and then Pitt came back and took that 31-16 lead. And at that point, you're like, okay, this one's going to end up at 41-16 or 44-16 or something like that, but it didn't. Tech immediately hit back with the touchdown pass to Lofton, and then got the punt block, which was aided by a high snap. But still you have to be playing hard to be able to take advantage of the other team's mistakes. You have to be mentally in the game, and Tech they did a good job of that. And even they did get a defensive stop later in the game. They got the defensive stop after. Gosh, it was 31-29. So after the block punt, then they came out and got the defensive stop, and then they've got the ball in midfield, and you're like, oh my gosh, we might actually come back and win this game. And then the Smith fumble happened. But yes, it was good to see the resiliency and the fight back, because you didn't really see much of that against UNC.
Tech made plays.
Yeah.
In anytime they weren't trying to tackle Abanikanda.
Even defensively, like, they had a bunch of tackles for loss. It was either like a tackle for a loss or a 20-plus yard game.
I think they had 11 tackles for 11 tackles for loss.
Yep.
Keonta Jenkins had the tip interception, the punt block by Pearson Prioleau, or sorry, not Pearson Prioleau, Pearson's son, PJ Prioleau. Radford High School's own, after the first sack since West Virginia, which was by Salem's Jaden McDonald. Like Tech actually made some plays in this game, and I know it didn't go Tech's way, but I came away, after talking with coaches and players after the game, I came away just feeling a bit better, just because against West Virginia, against North Carolina, they went up 2 scores, 3 scores, and the game was just done. You knew Virginia Tech wasn't really doing anything, and Tech couldn't generate anything offensively. And I thought Tech was better offensively. It helped that they had Malachi Thomas back.
Correct.
Keyshawn, the duo between him and Keyshawn King. Caleb Smith had a fantastic game, 9 catches for 152 yards. And yes, Tech could have made better plays, could have taken better angles. That Caleb Smith fumble was kind of a momentum swinger, but there are a lot of more positives than there have been in the past couple weeks.
I think the game ended up, we ended up where we thought we were going to. Like, we all picked Tech to lose by double digits. And our poll in the preview last week, 85% of the 1,200 voters picked Tech to lose by double digits. So the ending was what we thought it was going to be, but the route to get there was a lot different than we thought it was going to be. I like, if you thought the Tech offense was going to make progress, you would have thought it would have been the week before against the UNC defense, not against a physical Pitt defense that is, quite frankly, a much tougher matchup than the UNC defense. And if you were going to give up 45 points, you would have thought, I know they gave up 41 to UNC, but I didn't think Pitt could score 45 on them. So like, the direct opposite things happen that you would expect there. But from a positive perspective, it is great to see the offense take a step forward. Now the key is, like, don't take a step back.
Going.
Well, I think leaving the North Carolina game, there wasn't a lot to look back at and say, well, that gives me some hope for the future. I think in this game,
one does.
I look at that Daewon Lofton touchdown. That's what you expected from Grant Wells and Lofton. Right. Lofton beat a guy deep, and Wells showed off the arm strength and made a perfect throw. I think that kind of gives you some hope. Okay, maybe if these guys keep developing, maybe next year that becomes a pretty good tandem.
They certainly have to have another wide receiver to complement Caleb Smith. He's been a good, solid player for Tech this year, but when you just look at it statistically, there's nobody close to him. I guess you can say right now, I would say right now that Daquan Wright is the number 2 option for Virginia Tech. And he only played like 18 snaps. Or something. But he
comes in and he's a huge target, and they get him the ball every time.
He played early. He had a deep ball thrown to him early that was slightly overthrown, and then you didn't see him again until the fourth quarter. But then all of a sudden, I think he made a catch on like 3 straight plays.
It was one of Tech's scoring drives, I think, and Tech he had back to back. Oh, I think it was the Lofton drive, and he had back to back catches on like first and second down, and then Wells went deep to Lofton, and yes, Lofton seeing that is good, but the fact that Virginia Tech doesn't seem to have any other receiving options outside of Caleb Smith right now. Nick Gallo had that big game, at the beginning of the season, but hasn't done much since. And he's been better than the other tight ends, not named Daquan Wright.
Correct. Right.
And so, wide receiver wise, yes, Stephen Gosnell isn't playing, but Jaden Blue didn't really. I don't even think he had a catch.
I think he had 1.
So just. When Caleb Smith has 9 catches, that kind of tells you how little the spread is in terms of getting the ball to different targets, and Tech needs to change that.
This is something that will have to be addressed. Tech has too many slot types. Like, Caleb Smith is an outside receiver, obviously, but I mean, if you look at Lofton and Blue, they're both slot receivers that sometimes have to play on the outside because Tech doesn't have any other outside receivers. Even Gosnell was playing on the outside for Tech, but when he was at UNC, every snap in his career at UNC was from the slot. Like he's more of a natural slot, sit in the zone type receiver than he is an outside receiver. I don't know what's happened to Christian Moss. He played,
and he was on the sidelines, but I don't think he touched the field.
Didn't play a single snap on offense. He played well against Wofford, came up with a big catch against West Virginia, was running wide open behind the West Virginia defense at one point on the late hit call. And then I think he only played 6 snaps against UNC and now none against Pitt. So he looked like he was making progress. And I actually wrote an article and talked about, here's the number of catches he's had based on the number of passing plays he's been in the game for. And he had by far the highest catch rate of any Tech receiver on the team. And then they've just quit playing him. So he's but he's an outside receiver. He's a true outside receiver. So I think he's got to get more playing time to just create some more balance in the Tech passing attack. Because, like I said, right now, Caleb Smith is the only true outside receiver on that team.
I think we've seen more Jalen Jones, too, out there as well. We saw him against UNC a little bit on Saturday.
He's kind of a tweener type who can play in the slot or in the outside. But yeah, they said he was going to play more this past week, and he did, because he came up with a couple catches later in the game against UNC. So yeah, again, it would be nice if he would turn it on. It is kind of weird though to me. Early in the season, neither one of those guys were playing. Like, they didn't play a down against Old Dominion. They weren't even on the depth chart against Old Dominion, and then they start working him in more after that. And then Christian Moss seems like he's playing pretty well, and then he stops playing, and then they put Jalen Jones in, and seems like a weekly carousel at maybe that last wide receiver spot.
Well, let's talk some Beamer ball here. The week of the documentary that comes out, Dave and I watched it together. They talked all about Beamer ball and how Frank Beamer really turned special teams into a weapon and a way to score. Even though it was probably a net negative day for the special teams for Virginia Tech, PJ Prioleau goes through, gets the block, gets a touchdown, really swung the momentum back for the Hokies for at least a little bit.
Yeah, and I think... Again, and we writers up in the press box, we were kind of joking at the beginning of the game. I was nudging Aaron McFarling, and we were both kind of like, it'd be nice if Tech would just make a play, something to write about. Like there haven't been too many of those in the past couple weeks, and Tech made multiple plays, whether it was offensively or PJ Prioleau's block punt or Keontae Jenkins' interception. There were plays made, but that specific one, I mean, that's in a spot where who knows what the offense would have done if it had gotten the ball. And yes, it was kind of on Pitt for the snap, but he flew out there.
Yep.
And I think part of Brent Pry's message after the game, one of us asked Brent Pry about the blocked punt and about PJ Prioleau, and he basically said, this is a guy who was on the scout team, and he was playing so well, we gave him an opportunity. And I think that's kind of like, that is a message. That's more of a coach talking to his players and saying, look, it doesn't matter if you're on the scout. You can play if you continue to work hard and make an impact. And I think it's pretty cool. I mean, considering all the things his dad did here, and he gets to go out and block a punt, and Nike Johnson fell on it for a touchdown, and that was a big momentum swing. And yes, Tech didn't win, but that is progress, I think. And overall, it was the highlight of a very special teams day.
This game, at least something happened in this game. Yeah, like nothing ever happened in the UNC game outside of them scoring a bunch of points. But like this game was filled with many big moments, a lot of which were negative, of course, but there were plenty of positive plays in that game. At least this game, yes, it ended in a double-digit loss, but it kept you stayed mentally into the game pretty much until the end in this one, and that hasn't been the case the last couple of weeks for Virginia Tech.
Well, we talk about PJ Prioleau making the play. I know Katie in the fourth chair has a little bit more on the Prioleau clan.
I have to credit Nick Brown on this one. He reminded it to us and texted it to us this morning. Just the fact that PJ Prioleau blocked that punt. It was his birthday, so extra cake and ice cream for him. And then also so cool that his younger brother, Parker Prioleau, also blocked a punt this weekend on his game on Friday night against Carroll County. So Nick Brown reminded us of that. Of course, he calls the Radford games, and now they're 7-0, and Blacksburg High School is yet to win a game. So my old high school, Jesus, not great. But.
Well, Parker Prioleau blocking the punt against Frank Beamer's old high school too. That's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's right. It was against Beamer. Did go to Carroll County.
Yeah.
So good weekend to be a guy with the last name Prioleau who plays on special teams. I guess Parker had a better weekend because they won their game and we did not. But just a cool stat for sure.
Radford 7-0, I believe. Nick Brown calls them the City Kitties, the Radford Bobcats. So they are undefeated. Maybe a state championship coming to Southwest Virginia sometime later this year. Thank you, Katie. We'll check in back with you later. I did mention that it wasn't the best day special teams wise for Virginia Tech. Just subpar days for Will Ross and Peter Moore outside of a few good punts early.
It just seemed strange. And Will Ross, he missed his first kick of the season. He was 8 for 8, and I don't think you're going to miss eventually, I guess. This, of course, came after all the media members wrote a story on him like a week or two ago.
Naturally. Who's your story on this week? I'm
writing about basketball.
Oh, that's right, you are. Oh gosh, don't do that to our poor basketball.
No, but and Peter Moore did not look like himself punting the ball. I think he had an average of like 33.5 yards. Had multiple punts, but one of them, I think one of them Pitt got into him and like roughed him a little bit.
They did.
But Pitt tipped at least one or two. Ross had a point after that was blocked.
Right, and that one was his fault. He just didn't get the height on it.
Yeah.
Like the defensive tackles blocked it, but they got no penetration at all. Like they were way back there. So he didn't get the height on that one, and then he missed one himself, a field goal later. I think Peter Moore, like his first two punts when he's pinning them deep, were awesome. They were perfect. But like, even the one that like Pitt, obviously Pitt tipped one of them, but even the ones they didn't tip were like shanked, like kicked off the top of his foot. So something was off. Like, and whenever you see a player who, for the whole game, just looks completely different than what he normally looks like.
He's never played. Like, he's always been consistent,
right,
ever
exactly.
since he started
There's
punting.
never been any issues. So you wonder if like maybe he was carrying a little bit of an injury, whether he couldn't really push off his plant foot or something like that. But yeah, it was one of those days that like if Frank Beamer was watching that game, oh my God, he would have been going crazy for multiple reasons, like positive and negative. On special
and
teams.
Almost could have been worse because Jaden Blue had that muff punt that they said his knee was down, and he started.
That's right.
And he started returning punts this week instead of DJ Harvey, and I think there were 2 or 3 times where he caught it with his knee on the ground, and so he couldn't return it. Luckily, he did catch that one with his knee on the ground because he dropped it and Pitt picked it up, but his knee was down. So yeah, it was outside of the PJ Prioleau blocked punt. It was not a very good special teams day.
I must have just not been paying attention early in the game to who was returning kicks, because when I saw Prioleau block it and I saw 20, I was like,
DJ Harvey.
I was like, are we going to get called for a flag? Because isn't Harvey back returning the punt? Like, you can't have 2 20s on the field. Right. But they were at least smart enough to not make that mistake. One guy who was back on the field, Malachi Thomas, returned and had a pretty solid day as a tailback. It looks like he's going to get the lion's share of the carries now that he's back healthy.
Good vision, good patience. He's just a good natural runner. He also runs bigger than he looks. Like that one, the touchdown he had, which I think was his first carry of the season.
First carry, touchdown.
He really pushed the pile from about the 5-yard line all the way in, which is very impressive for a guy with his build against a defense like Pitt's, which is a very strong defense up the middle. It was kind of like one of his touchdown runs against Syracuse last year when he did the same thing. So it was very good to get him back. The blocking was a bit better up front this year, but he does a better job of setting his blocks up. I think. So even when, maybe your blocking isn't great, he knows how to still manipulate it. So he's a good natural running back. Hopefully he didn't experience any ill effects from his ankle or anything like that. But, he can certainly be a big asset to the offense. And I think it's pretty clear who the best natural running back is on the team. And I think it's pretty clear the 2 guys who need to be getting pretty much all the carries. If there's a third back that gets a carry on this football team, it needs to be Bryce Duke. Doesn't need to be anybody else. Because you want to justify not redshirting him. But if you want to give somebody, and if you want a short yardage running back, I know Holston's a big guy, but if there's anybody similar to Holston, it would be Bryce Duke from a size standpoint. And Holston doesn't have any years left, and Bryce Duke has his whole career ahead of him. So it seems to me like if you're not going to redshirt Duke, which they can't now, he would need to be the third guy. But for the most part, those top 2 backs, Malachi Thomas, Keshawn King, need to be the primary ball carriers.
Yeah, Thomas had 15 touches for 84 yards and 5.6 average. Keyshawn King only had 5 rushes for 26 yards and 5.2 average. And then the only other running back that had a carry was Jalen Holston. But you mentioned it in your story on Sunday. Neither one of them were tackled for a loss.
Pitt only had 1 tackle for loss against the running game. Their other 3 were sacks. So, yeah, I thought they're that All-American defensive tackle they had.
Kalijah Cansey.
Yeah, I thought Cansey was going to live in the backfield, considering how the Tech offensive line had played all year, and considering that he's an All-American and a dominant player. I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be bad. But it wasn't. It wasn't. They held up remarkably well. The Tech line did against him. So hopefully that's just not a one-off performance, and they can keep it going forward, because, well, look, the defense isn't going to give up 320 rushing yards every game. They're also not going to face any running backs like that for the rest of the season either. So that might be their worst defensive performance of the season. At least I hope.
Always against Pitt.
Yeah, always against Pitt. And so, like, just for the simple fact that I don't think they're going to face any running backs like that the rest of the season, I think the defense will get better from what we've seen the last couple of weeks. They just faced the best quarterback they'll face all year, and they just faced the best running back they'll face all year over the course of the last 2 weeks. I'm not gonna say it's all downhill from here, but it's certainly not going to be any tougher than that. So the defense will get better, by default, I think. Now, if the offense can
pull its own weight.
Yeah, right. Like, there are winnable games on the schedule starting this weekend.
Yeah, Miami not looking great coming into Blacksburg this weekend, and we'll have the whole preview on that coming up on Wednesday. But you've mentioned that this season, it's not as much about the wins and losses as it is about seeing improvement, seeing progress. And you mentioned the offensive line being better in run blocking. Again, we've mentioned it was pretty bad for the first couple weeks, but if that continues to tick in the right direction, I think that's a good sign moving forward for what Joe Rudolph can bring to this program.
When I got really worried is when they didn't show any improvement against West Virginia and North Carolina, particularly North Carolina. I mean, we can run through all North Carolina's numbers all we want about how awful they've been defensively. So I got really worried when Tech showed no improvement against a defense that has, quite frankly, just been a speed bump for most other offenses they've faced. So then they go out and show improvement against a Pitt defense that, generally speaking, has been, pretty solid. It doesn't make any sense, but I will take it. And like I said, I hope it's just not a one-off performance. Hopefully everybody can build some confidence, everybody involved in that operation, because, when you're a football player and, you're not playing well, either individually or collectively, it hurts your confidence. And when your confidence gets lowered, you're probably going to play even worse. So hopefully their confidence level is, on the upswing right now, and hopefully that leads to better results.
Yeah, and I think it helps to have Malachi Thomas back. I agree with Chris. Bryce Duke needs to get more carries, and not just a Wilkin fanboy. But I do think, like, in the first 4 or 5 games, Keyshawn King was not always 100%, and that meant the carries went to Chance Black, a guy who, as Chris has said many times, is not necessarily a running back, should probably be slotted at wide receiver. Jalen Holston, a guy who is kind of in the last stage of his playing career, and Bryce Duke, a true freshman. And now that you have another back to supplement Keyshawn King, Malachi Thomas told me after the game that he's 100%. He's feeling good. He's ready to go.
He looked 100%.
And he said there were conversations the last 2 weeks previously, West Virginia and North Carolina, about playing him, but ultimately the coaching staff decided not to. And he said he felt pretty good, but they just didn't go with him. But I think now, if Keyshawn, that duo, Malachi Thomas and Keyshawn King, they only ran the ball 20 times between the two of them. I think you've got to, obviously you want to get Malachi Thomas carries, but you've got to give the ball to King because he's pretty explosive too. But if that's your duo going forward, I think that kind of helps the offensive line go forward if there's that consistency, because it's not, I've never been an offensive line. I don't know how hard it is to block for 4 different running backs or 5 different running backs, but it doesn't sound like it's an easy task. And when everybody has different skill sets, and if King and Thomas are the 2 guys going forward, I think it'll bode well in the long run. 2
big weapons for the Hokies in the backfield for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And when you look at it, I think you have 2. I mean, I'd love to have a 215-pound grinder back there, but I think when you look at it, like Tech has 2 good running backs who are both capable of rushing for 100 yards on any given day. Yeah. But you've only got like 1 proven wide receiver. So you want to get to the point in games where you can run the ball more than you throw it. Now, those guys only combined for 20 carries on Saturday because for a good chunk of the game, yes, Tech was winning early, but then they fell down by 15.
Yeah,
and then
Grant Wells threw 47 passes.
Right. And then later in the game, obviously, for a lot of the fourth quarter, you're trailing. You need to play a football game where it's within one score the whole time, and those guys get more carries, and that way you can actually give the ball to your best players as opposed to throwing it to a group of wide receivers that are mostly complementary players and maybe shouldn't be getting as many snaps as they are.
Yeah.
If Tech had another wide receiver or two that were starting caliber at this level.
Yeah, I think controlling the clock is big. I was kind of surprised there were a couple times where Tech went no huddle, and it's like Pitt's leading, you need to be chewing clock. But I do think if you can make a statement in the run game and be able to run the ball, it will help out, I think, relax the wide receivers a little bit, especially because, like Chris just said, Smith is the only consistent option. But I don't know if they can put Daquan Wright out there, man.
Yeah, I would like to see an offense with two traditional outside receivers out there. Caleb Smith, obviously, on one side, and put Christian Moss out there on the other side, just because he's a natural outside receiver. And with Daquan Wright getting snaps, then I think your natural receiving talent goes up. And I realize that both those guys are redshirt freshmen.
Redshirt and true freshman.
Daquan Wright's a true freshman. But your natural receiving ability, your natural talent on the field goes up with those two players.
Yeah.
And I think that obviously Moss can't redshirt because he's already redshirted, and Daquan Wright is not going to redshirt at this point. So if you're in a situation where your most naturally gifted players are younger, then they need to go ahead and get more snaps.
Especially because after this year, what's the face of the wide receiver room?
Right. Well, I mean, Smith's got another year.
Smith does have another year.
But he's got a COVID year available,
but
too.
Yeah, but
Jaden Blue's gone one way or the other.
Yeah, but that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Like your two oldest, your two most veteran receivers in Blue and Smith. Smith could come back. He's a team captain. Maybe he would, but what happens if he chooses not to come back?
Right.
What happens if Blue obviously can't come back? So what's the face of the wide receiver room looking like? You have to start getting those guys meaningful reps.
Right. And well, the question is, like, Tech needs to take a receiver in the transfer portal this year. Now, whether they take one or two will be determined maybe whether Caleb Smith returns. But at the same time, like I don't want Christian Moss. He needs to be on this football team next year.
Yeah.
He's the most projectable of Virginia Tech's young wide receivers. So I think, again, I would try to get some snaps with him, Daquan Wright, and Caleb Smith on the field together at the same time. I just think that makes you that's your most physically gifted trio out there.
Definitely an opportunity in these last 6 games for the Hokies to get those young playmakers some reps. So we'll see if they maybe do that a little bit more as we head down the stretch here. We're going to get to our break here on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. But first, let's check in again with Katie in the 4th chair.
An attempt to continue my silver linings of the weekend segment was difficult because, given the bad mojo in Pittsburgh continuing and really every other fall sports team lost, men's and women's soccer both lost, volleyball lost, football lost, of course. There was a pair of good kickoff returns yesterday from Raheem Blackshear for Carolina, but I just got an ESPN notification that Matt Rule was just fired. So that's a name that I would look out for to be replaced, as a college coach this upcoming year. There's already been 5 firings in college this year, so I think that he might be a guy that's going to come back to college now, but that was just breaking news that
he's
got
owed
fired.
North of $40 million. Wow. Just for anybody who wants to become a fired head football coach.
I would move to the beach. I don't think I would coach anymore ever again. $40 million? Are you serious?
Adam Schefter, former Panthers head coach Matt Rule, now leaves Panthers being owed north of $40 million.
Good God.
Wow. Yeah, that was not a good game for them yesterday in Carolina, and that stadium was full of 49ers fans in Charlotte. But Raheem Blackshear did have 2 returns. He got back to the 50.
Yeah, I saw
and
that.
He hurt Robbie Gould, the Niners kicker, because he trucked right through him.
Is that why they didn't have
basically you're telling me he had the same amount of touches in one NFL game as he had for Virginia Tech last year against Miami.
And I thought he was going to catch on with the Bills after a good preseason.
He had a really good preseason.
But a couple of Hokies from last year's team are making impacts across the league. I know Amari Barno was active for the Panthers too for the first time yesterday. So yeah,
I saw
big day for
I saw a
Blackshear.
video of Christian Darrisaw absolutely pancake a dude yesterday.
I saw that. It was actually on a passing play too.
Yeah.
Just destroyed the dude.
Yeah. The Hokies are looking good for sure in the pros. Well, thank you, Katie, for your silver lining over there. Even though maybe Matt Rule will just do what Chris says and just sit on a beach somewhere, or he's going to Lincoln, Nebraska.
So I just read it on Twitter. He signed a this is completely off topic. He signed a 7-year, $62 million contract and lasted 38 games.
Well, did you see the stat that they've been putting around for the Panthers that I want to say they're now 1-27 when their opposing team scores more than 17 points since he took the job.
Isn't he regarded as an offensive guru?
Yep.
I thought so.
It was.
NFL's a lot
college.
different than college, man. It is a lot different than college.
So an opening in the NFL, and maybe Matt Rule feels one of those big openings in college football. I mean, he was great with Baylor, so we'll see what works out there. Well, we'll take our break here on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. When we come back, we're going to look at some more young guys who made an impact on Saturday. We'll also check in on some situational awareness issues for the Hokies in Pittsburgh, and also this week's edition of the ACC Power Rankings. That's coming up after the break on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline Podcast. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to episode 262 of the Tech Sideline podcast, brought to you by First Bank and Trust Company. A reminder, if you were watching in our live YouTube chat, please leave a question or comment for Chris and David. We'll get to those with Katie at the end of the show. We've already talked about a lot about that Pitt game, and we're going to get to your guys' ACC Power Rankings in a little bit here. But one thing I wanted to bring up, because Will was all over it on Twitter on Saturday, was we actually saw Pitt get called for some pass interference calls on Saturday, which usually you don't get against the Panthers.
ACC refs are notorious for letting them play as far as pass interference goes. I'm sure those calls just pleased Pat Narduzzi to no end. Yeah, but one of them was like a critical one that kept the drive going for Tech, right?
Yeah.
And Tech ended up scoring. I think both fan bases can look at that game and say, we made some critical errors. I feel like Pitt can say, I mean, Pitt's better than Tech. But I bet a Pitt fan is saying right now, it's like, man, we really should have
we let them in the game.
Right.
Yeah.
And Tech fans is probably saying, man, if we just didn't make these one or two critical errors, we could have won the game.
Yeah.
But, in the end, both teams made critical errors, and Pitt won by, 16. And that's probably about right. But yeah, I'm sure it was a little bit surprising for Narduzzi to see those flags thrown. But he wasn't very happy about them.
Well, we mentioned Caleb Smith having a big day, 9 catches for 152 yards, but did have that critical error right as Tech looked like they were about to get back in the game. He had the fumble right around midfield, and from then maybe 10 plays later, it was a 16-point game for Pitt again. It's just those little mistakes for Virginia Tech that they can't afford right now if they want to stay in games.
Yeah, obviously, like the Tech's talent level and their execution level means that they can't afford to make any critical errors. And we saw some of them like the fumble. Now, to Pitt's credit, that was a good hit.
I didn't see a replay, but from what I was told, it helmet to the ball.
Yeah, I mean it was like I said, it was a good hit.
Yeah.
And not to excuse any fumble or anything like that.
Smith actually, I believe, went to the injury tent.
Yeah, he did.
To get looked at.
He didn't
afterwards.
come back in on the next drive. The bigger ones that bother you are the ones that you have complete control of. You can't control whether Pitt makes a good hit on you,
Yes,
or not. You've got to do better in the kicking game. Got to make sure you're getting enough height on the kicks, things like that.
And you can't shoot yourself in the foot. Man.
Yeah, right.
The one that really stood out to me was right before halftime. The Tech's trying to kick a field goal, and Parker Clemens has the personal foul, hands to the face, the face mask call.
That's right.
That backed Tech up, and then Grant Wells got sacked on the next play, and Tech had to heave it instead of kicking a field goal.
Right.
And did that matter in the big stretch of the game?
Probably not, but you never know.
But who knows when that might come back and bite you down the road.
Exactly right. Because and the thing, and you can go to the first quarter, the first drive even, when it's 4th and 1, and you're going to go for it, and maybe Tech gets it on 4th and 1, maybe they don't. We know those adventures this year so far. But the interesting thing is, like, Tech had a really good short yardage conversion rate against North Carolina last week, and it was anything over 4th and 6.
And Bryce Duke was in the game,
3rd
too.
And 6 that they didn't get. Exactly right. So maybe they would have gotten it there. But they had the false start.
There was a false start and then a delay of game.
A delay of game on the field goal.
Field goal.
Yeah.
Like, you've got 25 seconds and you can't get it off. But yet again, there's another situation where, is anybody on the sideline looking at the clock? I mean, you got to get a timeout called there. If you see it gets down to 1 or 2 seconds, you got to call a timeout. So that, again, there's some clock management issues that we've seen that have got to get straightened out, because you look at some of these future games that seem like they're winnable. Even against Miami's very talented, but it is a winnable game. And then you've got Duke, you've got Georgia Tech, you've got Virginia,
Liberty.
Right. All those games have the potential to be very, very close games that Virginia Tech could certainly win. Yeah, you give yourself a much better chance to win them if you play a clean game.
Yeah.
And you don't have clock management issues and things like that. I don't think any of that has cost Virginia Tech a game yet. I don't want to be sitting here at the end of the Duke game or the end of the Georgia Tech game saying, God, we just lost a game because we committed a critical false start and compounded it with a delay of game
on a
penalty.
field goal.
Right. When we had a timeout, we could have used to prevent the delay again.
I mean, like imagine this scenario: Virginia Tech's trying to kick for the win against one of those teams. You get a false start and then a delay of game, and you're backed up 10 yards.
And now you have to punt.
Now you have to. I was going to say, now you have to. Now you have to either trust in your kicker to attempt like a 58-yard field goal, or So those are the scenarios where Tech had 8 penalties, but a lot of those were false starts, a lot of pre-snap, very controllable things, and it's not like there were a ton of pass interference or holding. I think there was maybe one holding call.
There's one defensive holding. But that was on a 3rd and 8.
And that was, that was Chapman, wasn't it?
Right. And then the next play, Pitt scored a touchdown.
Yeah. So, again, critical errors, but there were so few of the in-game penalties.
Right.
It's the pre-snap things that you have to control. And the fact that this is, the second or third time this year that we've seen a delay of game penalty?
The clock management thing is what bothers me more than anything. It's like you invested a lot of money in having a really big staff.
Yep.
Like, there's a lot of people on that sideline, and somebody's got to notice that the clock is winding down, right? That's the thing that bothers me the most.
And that's the third critical error, or not critical, but big mistake that really stands out in games. You had the timeout that came against ODU probably 30 seconds too late when they were in the red zone. I believe against West Virginia it was the same thing, a false start and then delay a game. And this one, obviously, it goes from maybe you extend the drive to, okay, at least we get a field goal, to, okay, now we have to punt.
Right.
Is this something that you're going to, if it continues to be a trend, is this something that's going to worry you, maybe even heading into the offseason?
What is a trend? Like at one point, do you say this might be a trend? And at one point, do you say, oh, yeah, this is definitely a trend? So Tech has played 6 football games, and a situation with the play clock has come up in 3 of those 6 football games. I'm not quite ready to say that it's a trend yet, but it's getting disturbingly close to being a trend.
If it's kind of like, I don't remember the previous staff having any issues with delay of games, and that's not like a shot at this staff or anything, but just like it just seems odd to when you have so many staff members. And it's not like they were all on the road, too. Like the West Virginia one was at home.
Right.
So it's not like, you could attribute it to they don't know where the play clock is, but that shouldn't be the excuse when you're at home in Lane Stadium.
They didn't understand basic rules of the game. Like they didn't understand that the clock was about to start after the penalty against ODU.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand that after the penalty against West Virginia, it wasn't going to be a 40-second clock again. It was going to be a 25-second clock. So they were just late getting the play in because they assumed they had 40 seconds. So they seemed like they didn't know the basic rules, and compounded by the fact that nobody was actually looking at the play clock in the stadium. So they need to get that cleared
I
up.
feel like it's a very fixable thing.
Yes, you would think.
It feels like, again, we've talked about the inexperience of the staff. First-time head coach, 2 first-time coordinators. Do you think it's just growing pains, just them trying to sort all that stuff out?
I hope so. Now, a lot of coaches have their get-back guy on the sideline. It's like, okay, pull me back if I'm getting out there on the field. Maybe he needs to have a clock guy right next to him. And
that's his only job.
Your only job. Hey, if you see that play clock go under 5 seconds, you start tugging on my shoulder, man. Yeah, maybe that should be the job.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully less issues with that moving forward. Before we wrap things up on Pitt, let's talk about some young guys. We've talked a little bit about Daquan Wright, but we saw Jaden McDonald get involved, get his first sack. A little bit more of Mansour Delane. He had a tackle for loss, a couple tackles as well. Seemed like you said, if you're not going to redshirt these guys, then play them. It seemed like we saw a little bit more of that on Saturday.
They didn't start him, but he still played. They did a 3-man rotation at corner, and he got plenty of reps in there. Ultimately, he did get beat deep once and got called for a hold, but for the most part, it didn't matter who Tech played at corner this game for the most part.
The pass defense was fine.
That wasn't the issue. I think if Pitt had thrown it more, they could have had more success. But why would you, when you've got a running back who's going for 320? The passing game will be a greater challenge next week against Miami because they've got a guy who can really challenge you deep down the field. Miami can really stress you deep. I know they haven't been as good this year as people thought, but the physical ability is there.
Yeah, in terms of young guys, Jaden McDonald impressed me, and I think, and you kind of wrote about this last week in your Inside the Numbers with Dax, and I think as a whole the linebacker group is getting better. I think Will is kind of they're still trying to figure things out there, but I like the way Keonta Jenkins and J.R. Walker played at Sam, and Dax looked like his normal self. I think, and it's an interesting point because Dax Highfield doesn't have any more eligibility left after this year. So what happens when Dax leaves? Who steps up there? Getting young guys reps. Jaden Keller, Kelly Lawson, Jaden McDonald, figuring that out. But yeah, I thought, to your question, I thought Delane was fine. I don't think there were any young guys that came out and made an error or something. You were like, oh, that's not supposed to happen. I think Virginia Tech is playing the young guys it trusts, and that's probably a good thing.
I've said this before. They got to get their linebacker situation straightened out because it's not fair to ask those redshirt freshman linebackers to play multiple positions. Like we've seen since the beginning of the spring, we've seen Jaden McDonald get reps either in practice or in games at all three linebacker positions, and so it's really hard to learn one position as a young player, much less all three. So every time you practice Jaden McDonald a snap at Sam, and then 2 weeks later he's starting at Will, then that was almost like a wasted snap 2 weeks ago. Like he could have been playing better maybe this past Saturday when he had to play so many snaps at Will. If he hadn't maybe spent so much time in the past practicing at Sam and Mike, right? And you've seen Will Johnson play Mike and Will. Kelly Lawson's the big one. He only moved to linebacker halfway through the spring, and then he got hurt and had to have surgery about halfway through the preseason this year. So that guy basically had a month of practice total as a linebacker before he played in his first college game. And in that month, they're practicing him at two linebacker positions. So you wonder why Kelly Lawson doesn't play well sometimes. I think his head is spinning, and it would be spinning. It's going to be spinning either way because he's a young player, but it's spinning even more because he's had to play multiple spots. Now, he had a rough game against UNC, so they didn't play him at all this past week. I want to get those guys locked into specific positions and have them take all their reps at that position, and I think that would speed up their development. So hopefully that's something that is starting to happen.
Yeah, I think of it, and you'll like this analogy. I think of it like a class. Like say you're learning in school. Say you're taking a history class, and the teacher decides they're going to teach you about the American Revolution and the Civil War and World War II all at the same time. And they're just going to teach a little bit of this and this and this all in the same class. And it's like, how the heck am I supposed to differentiate everything?
You have average knowledge of a bunch of different subjects, but not good knowledge of any one subject, right?
Hopefully they straighten that out, get some guys locked into some positions. Last thing here on Pitt, do want to give some props. No Taiwan Garbett on Saturday, and Jalen Griffin, 2.5 tackles for loss. He lived in the backfield for a while.
The thing is, like we say so many of these guys statistically, he played well. Well, quite frankly, hardly anybody played well over the course of four. When you give up 320 rushing yards, you don't play well. They had a lot of issues at defensive end and at the will spot and at the safety spots with their run fits and things like that. Some of it was just mental mistakes. Some of it, like the last Pitt touchdown run, the really, really long one, it was like that offensive tackle just destroyed Cole Nelson. Just took him inside and pushed him into where the linebackers were, and that was it. I think this team the defense has more potential than what they showed on Saturday. But like I said, they were either making plays or they were getting destroyed. There was no in between. Yeah, so it does make you feel better. Yes, they have some playmaking ability, but they've got to play more consistency. So the last time Tech, not the last time, but in 2018 when Tech played at Pitt, and Pitt only ran something like 47 offensive plays, but they had over 600 yards of offense. Well, 8 of the plays Pitt ran were actually tackles for loss by the Tech defense, which means on the other 38 plays or whatever, Pitt averaged 17.4 yards per play. So Tech's defense was either making a big play
Or giving one up.
Or like giving up like 80-yard runs. I mean, there was no in between. Now, the good news is that Tech defense, which finished 98th in the country in total defense, they morphed into the 2019 defense, which finished 42nd in total defense. Probably would have finished higher if Caleb Farley hadn't been hurt the last 2 games of the season. And they shut Pitt out the next year. Yeah. After the worst defensive performance in Tech history, they came back the next year against the same team and shut that team out with Kenny Pickett as quarterback. Yeah. Now, granted, it was in a rainstorm, but still. I think this Tech defense is probably a little more projectable across the board than the 2018 Tech defense was. In fact, I know it is. Now, it didn't have like a top end. It doesn't have like a top end talent like Caleb Farley, I don't think, who was going to progress and go on to be a first round pick. But I do think across the board, this Tech defense has more ability. So they will get better if they're well coached, and I do believe defensively Tech is well coached.
That's what I was going to say. Is through the first 5 weeks of the season, the questions were about the offense. And we know the defense just got absolutely gashed. For the first time this year, it was not the offense that had the question marks. And I think that's both a good thing and a bad thing. Like, it's good that the offense is not the one with the question marks, but it's bad that you have to place the blame somewhere, obviously. But I do think through 5 games, like it wasn't the best performance against North Carolina, but you're facing a really good quarterback in Drake May. And this is kind of like what Chris said earlier. Abanikanda is probably the best running back Virginia Tech's going to face all year. So, in theory, it should be a regression to the mean, and Tech should be better defensively. My biggest questions lie with the offense and if we can see steady improvement, but I do think Brent Pry knows his defense, and you saw Tech play pretty good defense through the first couple games in a lot of stretches. So it's kind of just getting back to that, and they've got a big test on Saturday.
It's the old things are never as bad as they seem and never as good as they seem. Like, the Tech defense is nowhere near as good as it looked against Boston College or Old Dominion, but it's also nowhere as bad as they looked the last 2 weeks, in my opinion. So
not 20 something in terms of rush defense, but also not dead last in the country.
Right. I think at the end of the season, we're going to look at this defense and say it's an average defense. Yeah.
And looking to get back on track against Miami, who, again, hasn't had their best stuff offensively the last couple of weeks. I believe only put up 17 against UNC on Saturday.
They ended up with 24. 27-24. Yeah. But so you look at Van Dyke's stats, it was like, okay, he got benched in their previous game, but came back strong in this game and put up really good. At one point, I want to say he was like 17 of 20 or something like that in that game. I forgot. I looked up at the TV at one point and saw the stats, and he'd thrown for a lot of yards. Granted, that's against the UNC defense, though. The UNC defense struggled against anybody not named Virginia Tech. So how much was that of Van Dyke finally getting it together and playing like he's capable? How much of it was the UNC defense? I still think Miami can be had this week. They also have the potential to come in and like blow Tech out because they have talent, but they also have the potential to lose. The key is Virginia Tech's got to be in the right mental state this week, and they've got to clean up some of those unforceable errors, but we'll talk about that more on Wednesday.
We will. Full Miami preview on Wednesday. We're also going to talk a little bit about Miami in our final segment, the ACC Power Rankings, but first, let's check in with Katie one more time in the fourth chair.
Football is just weird right now. We're living in a season where Virginia Tech is 2-4 for the first time in 30 years. JMU is ranked, and Virginia Tech and Virginia are not, and they're ranked for good reason. I mean, they are a powerhouse of a football team. I would be terrified if we had them on our schedule this year.
No, it's not.
Syracuse undefeated going into a ranked matchup with NC State when NC State has looked vulnerable. And then as a precursor to Wednesday, we talked about it before the show, but David Teal tweeted out how this is the first Virginia Tech-Miami matchup ever where both teams come in with losing records. And it's like the first time that it hasn't been broadcasted on
a big ESPN Family Networks, probably.
Yeah.
It's one of the few times, for sure.
It's an RSN game. Yeah.
So just when you think you've seen it all, you haven't.
And you see a Brent Venables team not playing defense, right?
Yeah.
Like, that's speaking of, like, we were talking about coaches getting fired and Matt Rule getting fired and how he's owed $40 million.
Brent Venables.
Like, you don't want to kick the dirt on somebody so early in their career, but he has Oklahoma talent. Like, how do you lose 49-0? Like, their defense, they can't play anything. Yeah. And their offense isn't any better. So that's a tough time to be an Oklahoma fan. I wish we could get them on the schedule.
Yeah. As far I was going to mention one thing really quick about Miami. Remember that this is the last time Virginia Tech plays Miami at home until 2026 because of the new schedule format coming out next year. So soak it in while you can, I guess.
Yeah, it's true.
It's homecoming weekend too.
It is homecoming weekend. Expect a pretty good crowd, despite it being a 12:30 kick.
It's going to be a nice weather. Should be, I think the high on Saturday is about 60 degrees.
Yeah, first time back in Lane Stadium since the West Virginia game. Had 3 in a row and now only 3 the rest of the year. All right, well, thank you, Katie, for that. And with that, let's dive into this week's edition of our ACC Power Rankings from Chris and David. If you are on YouTube, you should see these on the screen, but we'll go through these one by one. We started at the bottom the last couple weeks. We're going to save that for the end. Okay. Let's start at the top. You guys are in lockstep for the top 4 Atlantic teams. Both of you have Clemson 1, Wake Forest 2, NC State 3, and Syracuse at 4, and a big matchup between the Wolfpack and the Orange this weekend.
I'm very excited for that. I don't remember what time. You know what time that game's at? I don't remember. I've got friends that cover both teams, so I will be keeping up with that one. That's kind of like I was gonna think that's like the premier ACC matchup of the weekend. And then you got Clemson, Florida State on ABC at 7:30. So
yeah, I mean, as far as name factor, that one certainly is.
Correct. Yes.
I think Clemson's going to handle them though.
Yeah, well, I think I'm very excited to see kind of if Syracuse is for real this week.
And that game's at 3:30.
Okay, and Clemson's not going to be anywhere but number 1 on this list for either one of us unless they lose a game. So.
Going forward, a little bit of difference here at 5 and 6. Chris, you like UNC at 5 and 1 a little bit better than Florida State. Mm-hmm. David, you have the Noles ahead of the Heels.
Yeah, I kind of just and they played at NC State close.
Yeah.
They were winning 17-3.
They were winning until the fourth quarter, and then they kind of fell apart. North Carolina. North Carolina Duke this weekend is going to be a really interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, Duke's kind of going in the wrong. We can talk about them later. I've got North Carolina over Florida State for the simple fact that I think Drake May would be the great equalizer and would be the best player on either team. So,
yeah.
7, you guys both have the Pitt Panthers after their win against the Hokies this weekend. In 8, Chris, we're seeing a rapid ascension of the Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets.
It must be insane how bad of a coach Jeff Collins was, because they could never win with him, and all of a sudden he gets fired and they win 2 in a row, 2 ACC games. I mean, they have 2 ACC wins, which is more than Miami, that's why I have them 8th, is that they've won 2 in a row. So what have you done for me lately? Well, they've won 2 in a row, and they're both ACC wins, so I've got them at 8th.
David, you've got Miami holding strong at 8. I believe you had them there that last week too. No movement after a 3-point loss.
What? When it comes to like that middle group, like none of those teams impress me at all. And and Duke goes out and loses. I think I had Duke at 9. 7 last week. I have Duke at 9 this week. I have Georgia Tech at 10. I could have put Georgia Tech higher. I'm still not sold on Georgia
I'm not
Tech.
sold. It's just a what have you done for me lately
That's true.
thing. Yeah.
And Chris, you have Miami 9. Duke is at 10. And then you guys have the same bottom 4 in the same order. Louisville gets a nice little bump. They were in the cellar for both of you last week, all the way up to 11.
Deservedly, because they lost to Boston College, and now they won on the road with their backup quarterback.
Without Malik Cunningham, goes out. They thumped UVA.
They sure did.
In 12, Hokies fans not happy to be in 12th, but better than 13th or 14th.
I think did I bump them up one spot?
One of you did. I forget. One of you had them 13.
Yeah, I think I probably did. And I had BC higher than Tech last week. Again, what have you done for me lately? It's just power rankings. But now I have BC back. BC lost.
BC got killed
as soon as BC lost
Clemson.
the game, they were going to go back below Tech in my rankings, and they did. They played Clemson and lost.
31-3 was the final
and
there.
That was 3-3 late in the second quarter, actually. So I'm like, are they going to be able to pull this off? And I'm like, nah, there's no way they can score a touchdown against Clemson.
Clemson cover was never in doubt.
So, to me, they're 13th, and they get the nod over
a brilliant
something Hokies fans can rejoice about. David and Chris both have Virginia at dead last.
Well, I mean, they lost at home to a Louisville team that has played poorly this year with their backup quarterback. The backup quarterback for Louisville went on the road and beat UVA in front of about what looked like 25,000 people or thereabout in the picture I saw on Twitter. Just
so let me pose this question: what do you think the score would have been if Abanikanda did not play? Like if Pitt's backup running back was out?
That's a great question.
Because
looking back, when none of us thought he was going to play.
Yeah, and so I don't know how much of it would change stuff.
It would change,
but I don't think, like, obviously he ran for 6 touchdowns and 300 yards. It's going to change a lot. But the fact that Malik Cunningham is out and it looked like the score looked like he played.
You put at least another 10 points up there for Louisville, I would say.
Yeah,
right?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't see how you could pick UVA anywhere but last this week.
Thanksgiving week can't get here soon enough.
You know, they
2-4 and 2-4. What are the chances there are 6 combined wins between Virginia and Virginia Tech heading into that game?
Well, they're already combined for 4.
I think they'll get 2 at least.
Yeah, I think so. I would set it at like 7.5, something like that.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, but at any rate, like UVA. First, their defense was hanging in there earlier in the year and playing much better, but now they're starting to collapse even on the defensive side of the ball while not showing much improvement on offense. Their running game is horrible. Yeah. What did they say? They had like 20 carries for 2 yards.
Maybe they shouldn't have fired their offensive coordinator. They're currently at Syracuse.
Well,
And Wayne Talapapa also having a lot of success with the top 10 Washington team, or at least they were heading into last week.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's true.
So there we go. Virginia at 14. Hokie, it could be one of the more competitive Commonwealth clashes in a long time.
That's insane.
I don't know. They've all been competitive.
That's true.
recently.
They have been competitive lately.
Yeah.
Hopefully we see that trend continue, and hopefully the Hokies come out on top again. So there are your ACC Power Rankings for this week. Some big matchups at the top this week with, again, Clemson playing Florida State and NC State playing Syracuse, so could see some more shuffle at the top in those Atlantic teams in next week's edition. That about wraps up what we've got. Do we have any good questions in the chat, Katie?
You guys have talked about this a little bit, but just a couple questions about if, they should be playing the freshmen over the seniors more, Wright over Gallo, Delane over Murray, and why these older guys are making more mistakes than maybe the freshmen are.
No, I mean, I think from a tight end's perspective, I think Gallo's been fine. I think it's the other two. Like, Blumerick hasn't really looked great. He had that, call it a screen or whatever you want, where the ball kind of just went right through his hands. And Duilius hasn't. I think Duilius' playing time is kind of decreased.
Duilius is the one that blew the block on the was it the punt or the field?
I think it was a punt.
Yeah, and just has played poorly. So yeah I mean, Wright's taking his snaps and should probably have all of them.
If it was me, it would go Gallo, Wright, and
I would play 2 tight ends and maybe Blumerick in certain situations, but. Yeah, I mean, it depends on the freshman and how capable he is, and how physically capable he is. Like, I wouldn't play Cam Johnson; he needs to redshirt.
Yeah.
Like, it's more beneficial to him long term to hit the weight room. Delane, obviously, you play a lot.
Yeah, I don't know if you give him like Breon Murray's snap count at corner just because he's a true freshman. But if he can handle it, he can handle it. Like,
I would.
Well, look, I just mean, like, I would try and see how long he can go, but if,
Well, the thing is, whenever Pitt completed a pass the other day, it was generally right at Breon Murray. So, I mean, I think that's a move I would most definitely make. It depends on the player. Like, you also want to establish culture. Like, if you have a senior that is the right cultural fit and is the right leader and is doing everything you ask from a work ethic standpoint, and you want people like that to set the foundation of your program, then I don't want to take their playing time away unless the freshman is outperforming them. Yeah. Then in which case, sure, go ahead. So redshirt as many guys as you can, because this is a rebuilding year, unless that freshman is going to play a lot.
Yeah.
For the most part, though, like, you're seeing the freshmen who are playing, like those guys at the will spot, like, they're all playing because every single player at that position is a freshman. Yeah. There aren't any older guys there. But I'm not taking Dax's snaps away.
And he's played well.
Yeah, he's been fine. There's no issues there anyway. But you know what? Again, running back is one where I feel like if you're going to use a third back at all,
It better be Bryce Duke.
Go ahead. It's got to be Bryce Duke to me. Although again, you know, there's a cultural thing. Like Holston's always been a really hard worker and things like that. But it's always a tough line to balance because you're trying to establish your culture, but you also want to do what's best for each one of those young players, like
and for the program in the future.
Right, exactly. So you got to take that on a case by case basis.
Anything else in the chat? All right, perfect. Well, that wraps things up here on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Before we get out of here, Chris, David, what is coming up on TechSideline.com?
Normal week. Will have Monday thoughts. David's going to have, actually, it's not a normal week.
It's not a normal week.
Not for David.
Not for me. I am, so this afternoon, it is 12:15. As soon as I get off of here, I'm going to put my finishing touches on a feature story I wrote on Sean Padula. That Chris is going to take a look at. It'll run this afternoon. Jack Brizendine he sat down with Tony Roby and wrote a wrestling preview. So we're going to have that today.
Sweet.
And then I am leaving sometime this afternoon to hit the road for Charlotte. And we've got ACC basketball media days the next couple of days. So I will be pulling double duty from Charlotte. We've got basketball and I'll be doing football stuff remotely. Women's basketball media day Tuesday, men's basketball media day Wednesday. And it's a normal football week, but with a bit of basketball thrown in there.
Too bad they didn't do basketball like next week during the bye week. But then again,
now I get to enjoy my bye week.
That's true. Yeah. That's true. So a lot of content this week. Great time to subscribe to TechSideline.com. So make sure you hop on that. That'll wrap things up here on episode 262 of the Tech Sideline podcast. Want to thank you for listening. Thank everybody on set. David Cunningham, managing editor for Tech Sideline across the way. You can find him at @TheRealDCunna on Twitter. To my right, Chris Coleman, lead analyst and columnist for Tech Sideline. He is at Chris Coleman TSL on Twitter. In the fourth chair, Katie Adams did a great job. She'll be back hosting the preview podcast for Miami on Wednesday. You can find her at Katie6Adams on Twitter. Behind the scenes, our founder and general manager, Will Stewart, at Will Stewart TSL. Training Carter Hill behind the scenes, who did a great job today. And I'm your host, Jake Lyman. Signing off. Have a great start to your week, Hokies fans. We'll talk to you next time.